In the basement archives of Millbrook County Courthouse, a clerk named Sarah Hendricks found something that made her hands shake. The marriage ledger from 1943 showed 2 entries for the same woman, Martha Craddock, age 21, marrying first to Thomas Craddock on June 15th, then again on December 3rd to James Craddock. The birth certificate, filed 9 months later, listed both men as father to the same child. Someone had scratched the June entry with a penknife, gouging the paper until it bled ink. But they'd rewrote it 2 columns over in darker, more deliberate strokes. The coroner's margin note, barely legible, read, "Same jaw fracture pattern in mother and infant, impossible unless." The rest was torn away. 3 headstones in Ridge Hill Cemetery bear identical names spanning 40 years. Martha Craddock, 1943. Martha Craddock, 1987. Martha Craddock, 2019. Same birth date. Same death cause listed as complications of birth. This is the story of a case that broke 3 doctors, silenced a federal investigation, and left files sealed for 50 years. A story of Ridge Hollow, where bloodlines curve back on themselves like the mountain roads, and where some unions produce more than children, they produce returns. Subscribe so these files don't disappear again. Ridge Hollow sits in the Appalachian fold where Tennessee bleeds into Kentucky, a valley that catches fog like a cupped palm and refuses to let it go. State Route 412 winds down from the ridge in lazy spirals, each turn bringing you deeper into mist that tastes of copper and old wood. Locals say the road was built wrong, that surveyors kept finding their instruments pointing in circles, their measurements never adding up to the maps they'd drawn the day before. The hollow houses may be 300 souls, though census takers have never gotten the same count twice. Houses cluster around a central common where an old well sits, its stone lip worn smooth by hands that have drawn water here for generations. Children are taught never to drop coins down that well, not for wishes, but because of what might hear them hit bottom and decide to climb back up. Paper records from Ridge Hollow have a way of going missing or contradicting themselves. Marriage certificates filed in duplicate show different names on different copies. Birth records list impossible parentage. Death certificates get lost and refiled with new dates. But the stories stay consistent, passed down in whispers between women hanging laundry, in muttered warnings between men sharing shine on porch steps. The government learned early that some places resist documentation. Ridge Hollow is one of them. You can file your reports, take your photographs, seal your evidence in manila envelopes, but the Hollow keeps its own records, carved in applewood and written in blood that never quite dries. The Craddock name appears on the first land deed filed for the Hollow in 1847, but locals swear the family was there long before any courthouse recognized their claim. Jeremiah Craddock and his wife Patience built the first permanent structure, a log cabin that still stands, though it's been added onto so many times that finding the original walls requires knowing where to look. What survives in family papers is a leather-bound journal attributed to Patience herself, though the handwriting changes subtly throughout, as if multiple women wrote in the same careful script. The entries speak of sacred obligations and the circle that must not break. References appear to an applewood ring, carved with initials that spiral inward toward a center that hurt to look at directly. "The quiet speaks to those who listen," reads one entry dated 1851. "We have heard it call our names in voices we know. James has fashioned the ring from the tree that split in the storm, split, but grew back together, stronger than before. When the quiet answers, the bride returns." Multiple accounts from that era describe overlapping laughter coming from the Craddock cabin late at night, the sound of many voices sharing the same joke that no one else understood. Neighbors reported seeing duplicate figures in windows, the same woman standing in 2 frames simultaneously, or a child playing with its identical twin in the yard, both wearing the same torn dress. By 1860, other families had joined the Craddocks in the Hollow, drawn by promises of fertile land and close community. They learned quickly that some promises came with obligations that weren't discussed until after the wedding vows were spoken and the applewood ring had been pressed into willing palms. The system that governed Ridge Hollow operated on principles of rotation and return. Families took turns hosting what they called the blessing, a responsibility that passed from household to household in carefully maintained cycles. Surviving quilts from the era show patterns that map these rotations, geometric spirals that lead the eye inward towards centers marked with small, dark stains that never quite faded, no matter how many times the fabric was washed. Ledgers kept by successive family matriarchs document not just births and deaths, but returnings, ceremonies that occurred when certain bloodlines reached what they termed completion. The handwriting in these ledgers shares the same curious uniformity found in Patience Craddock's journal, as if the same careful penmanship passed from woman to woman like an inherited trait. Marriage records show a pattern that becomes clear only when mapped across generations. Names repeat in spiraling arrangements, bloodlines curving back on themselves with mathematical precision. James married Martha, who bore a daughter named Martha, who married her cousin James, whose son James would later marry his aunt Martha. The pattern held for over a century, with only minor variations when outside blood was needed to strengthen the line. A single page survives from what appears to be an instructional folio, written in the same careful script. The ring passes to the one who understands. Understanding comes through proximity of blood, through the weight of obligation, through the willingness to answer when the quiet calls. Draw the spiral with your finger in applewood smoke. Feel how it pulls the eye inward. This is how we return. The page includes a drawing executed in heavy, dark strokes, a spiral that seems to continue beyond the paper's edges, as if the artist had traced something that existed independent of the medium used to capture it. The Craddock house grew organically over the decades, additions sprouting from the original cabin like growths from a living organism. By 1920, it had become a maze of corridors that led into other corridors, of rooms that opened onto rooms that somehow occupied the same space. Windows faced other windows across impossibly narrow gaps, creating an optical effect that made visitors dizzy. The well in the center of the common appeared to widen as it deepened, its stone walls spiraling downward in measurements that frustrated every surveyor who attempted to map them. Water drawn from that well reflected images that didn't match the faces looking down into it, sometimes older versions of the same features, sometimes younger ones, sometimes faces that belonged to people who had been dead for decades. A fire assessor's report from 1965 noted structural anomalies that defied conventional building practices. Every wall in the main house refuses to read plumb, but the deviations follow a consistent pattern that suggests intentional design rather than settling or poor craftsmanship. Load-bearing beams show stress patterns consistent with supporting significantly more weight than the visible structure should generate. The basement, according to multiple accounts, contain D rooms that couldn't be accessed from the same entry point twice. Visitors described finding themselves in circular chambers lined with mirrors that showed reflections of the same room from different angles, as if the space existed in multiple orientations simultaneously. Chalk marks left on walls to track navigation would appear in different locations the next day, arranged in spiral patterns. Church records from various denominations mention attempts to bless or consecrate the property, but every effort resulted in the same outcome. Holy water evaporated before touching the floors, prayer books fell open to blank pages, and religious artifacts developed hairline cracks that spread in spiral patterns until the objects became unusable. Dr. Malcolm Pettigrew received the letter on hospital stationery that felt wrong under his fingers, too smooth, too cold, with an oily residue that wouldn't wash off. The wax seal bore the impression of a ring, the pattern pressed deep enough to catch shadows. Someone had scored the wax with what looked like tooth marks, creating a jagged border around the central spiral. "We have need of your skills," the letter read in that same careful script found in generations of hollow records. "Our Martha carries a blessing that requires observation by trained eyes. We offer fair payment and ask only discretion in your documentation." Pettigrew arrived in Ridge Hollow on a Tuesday in September 1943. his medical bag heavy with instruments that would prove inadequate for what awaited him. His journal, discovered years later in his abandoned practice, documents his first impressions with the clinical detachment of a man trained to observe and record. The house presents spatial challenges that my medical training did not prepare me to address. Examination rooms accessed through the same doorway lead to different locations depending on time of day. Have attempted to map the layout 3 times with identical measurements yielding contradictory results. His sketches show paired portraits hanging in hallways, photographs of the same woman at different ages, or of different women sharing identical features across decades. Dolls arranged on shelves in precise rows, each one a perfect duplicate of its neighbors, their glass eyes tracking movement with synchronized precision. Patient's family maintains a chapel in the cellar, one entry notes. Pews arranged in concentric circles around a central depression that appears to have been worn smooth by repeated use. No religious iconography visible, but the walls show carved spirals that create an optical effect of movement when viewed by lamplight. The journal entries cease abruptly on September 28th, the final line reading, "Martha's condition progresses beyond any documented case in medical literature. Have requested consultation from colleagues, but..." The rest of the page had been torn away, leaving only the faint impression of words pressed hard enough to indent the paper beneath. Martha Craddock, at 21, had been married to her cousin James, age 34, for 3 years when Dr. Pettigrew first examined her. His notes describe a pregnancy that defied every principle of obstetric medicine he'd learned during his residency at Johns Hopkins. Patient's skin has acquired a translucent quality that allows visualization of vascular structures normally hidden from surface observation. Vein patterns shift position between examinations, creating map-like formations that pulse in rhythm with fetal movement. Patient reports no discomfort, despite obvious distension of abdominal cavity. The examination room's instruments behaved strangely in Martha's presence. Stethoscopes picked up multiple heartbeats at different rhythms, creating overlapping patterns that sounded like whispered conversations. Blood pressure cuffs inflated beyond their mechanical limits, then deflated in spiral patterns that left marks on Martha's arms resembling the carved rings worn by hollow women. Fetal movement visible through abdominal wall appears coordinated rather than random, Pettigrew wrote. Patient states she can feel the child arranging itself in preparation for what she terms the return. When questioned about this terminology, Patient smiles and places hand over her heart, then over her abdomen, creating the same gesture I have observed in other hollow women. Martha's eyes began changing color during her 7th month, shifting from brown to a pale amber that seemed to hold flecks of deeper gold. When she spoke, her voice occasionally layered over itself, as if 2 people were forming the same words at slightly different speeds. The family referred to this as the doubling, and treated it as a sign that the pregnancy was progressing normally. Hospital staff reported hearing humming from Martha's room late at night. Not her voice, but something that seemed to emanate from her abdomen, a sound like tuning forks resonating in harmony. Night nurses documented hearing responses to this humming from other rooms in the maternity ward, as if whatever grew inside Martha was calling to other children and receiving answers. The birth began at midnight on October 13, 1943, and lasted until dawn. 3 doctors attended: Pettigrew, Dr. James Morrison from the county hospital, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist summoned from Lexington. One never practiced medicine again. Martha's labor produced no screaming, only a low humming that grew in volume and complexity as the hours passed. The delivery room's overhead lights began flickering in patterns that matched the rhythm of her contractions, casting spiral shadows that rotated across the walls. Blood-tinged amniotic fluid flooded the tile floor in quantities that should have been fatal, but Martha remained conscious and alert throughout. The child emerged with an oversized skull dome so translucent that separate brain lobes were visible pulsing beneath the surface. The fontanelles gaped wider than any normal infant's, with hairline fractures spreading along suture lines that split and rejoined in geometric patterns. Each pulse of cerebral fluid sent spiderweb cracks radiating outward, only to heal and crack again in slightly different configurations. Its hands bore 7 fingers arranged in a spiral fan, each digit perfectly formed but ending in split nail beds that wept clear fluid. The limbs emerged at angles that required impossible bone structures, arms that bent backward at the elbow before curving forward again, legs that seemed to contain additional joints hidden beneath skin so thin it showed the dark network of blood vessels threading underneath. Multiple eyes tracked movement independently, not just the expected pair, but additional organs of sight positioned where temples and forehead should have been, each one a different shade of amber, each one leaking vitreous fluid that traced silver lines down cheeks that overlapped like multiple faces occupying the same skull. The infant made no crying sounds, instead producing overlapping vocalizations like radiostatic layered over humming, with pink froth bubbling at lips that moved out of sync with the sounds emerging from its throat. Dr. Morrison left the room during the initial examination and never returned. Dr. Chen completed her notes, then burned them in the hospital courtyard before driving back to Lexington. Nurses found the body 6 hours later arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor, a thin dark arc smeared around it like the trail of something that had crawled in circles before coming to rest at the center of its own pattern. For 6 days, the infant lived in the hospital's isolation ward, existing in a state that challenged every definition of normal development. Instead of crying, it produced that same overlapping humming that had emanated from Martha's abdomen, the sound growing more complex, as if it were learning to harmonize with itself. Nurses reported that the child recognized family members in ways that defied newborn neurological capacity. When Martha's mother entered the room, the infant's multiple eyes would track her movement, while its malformed hands reached toward her in gestures that mimicked adult recognition. When James approached, the humming would shift to lower tones that seemed to carry emotional undertones. The medical staff found themselves torn between scientific fascination, basic human compassion, and a growing nausea that accompanied prolonged exposure to the infant. Dr. Pettigrew's final notes describe a wrongness that penetrates observation, as if the act of witnessing this condition creates complicity in something that violates natural law. Family members maintained vigils around the clock, taking shifts in a pattern that reflected the rotation system governing other aspects of hollow life. They brought items from home, quilts bearing the spiral patterns found throughout their community, hand-carved wooden toys, and small portions of food that they placed near the infant's bed, despite its inability to consume solid nourishment. On the 3rd day, pink froth began appearing regularly at the child's lips, each bubble containing what appeared to be microscopic formations that created brief, impossible geometric patterns before bursting. Night shift nurses documented the growth of these formations, noting that they seemed to respond to external stimuli with movements that suggested primitive organization. The end came quietly on the 6th morning, marked not by the cessation of vital signs, but by the sudden silence that filled the isolation ward when the humming finally stopped. The child's body showed no signs of distress or struggle. It simply ceased, as if it had completed whatever purpose had required its brief existence. Within hours of the infant's death, unmarked sedans began arriving at Ridge Hollow Community Hospital. Men in dark suits identified themselves as investigators from the center, no additional designation provided, and produced federal warrants that superseded local authority. They confiscated the body, all medical records, photographs taken during the birth, and the entire contents of Dr. Pettigrew's office. Hospital staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that threatened prosecution under national security statutes for any discussion of the case. The official death certificate listed cause as multiple congenital anomalies with no further details. Dr. Chen's consultation notes, thought destroyed, were somehow recovered and seized along with all other documentation. Martha Craddock was discharged with a clean medical record showing a normal pregnancy and delivery. Her original charts vanished from hospital files, replaced with standard documents that recorded no unusual circumstances. When questioned, staff members provided consistent statements describing a routine birth with no complications worth noting. The infant's body was reportedly transported to a federal facility for incineration, though no official records confirmed disposal. Local rumors suggested it was preserved for study, but no evidence supports these claims. What is documented is the immediate classification of all related materials under national security protocols that sealed the files for 50 years. Dr. Pettigrew abandoned his practice within a month, leaving Ridge Hollow without explanation. His house stood empty until 1965, when it burned under circumstances that fire investigators never satisfactorily explained. Dr. Morrison transferred to a hospital in California and never spoke publicly about his brief involvement with the case. Only Dr. Chen maintained her practice, though colleagues noted she never again accepted obstetric consultations. In spring 1944, a child appeared in Ridge Hollow with no family connections or explanation for his presence. The boy, who appeared to be around 7 years old, bore a ring-shaped scar on his left palm and spoke in a voice that occasionally doubled over itself, like an echo arriving too quickly. Local families took turns feeding and housing him, but he refused to sleep under any roof, instead building shelters from branches and scrap materials that he arranged in circular patterns. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with news of places he couldn't have reached on foot and knowledge of events he had no way of witnessing. The child carved spirals into tree bark with his fingernails, creating patterns so precise they looked machine-made. He drew similar formations in the dust of barn floors, in the frost on windows, and in the ashes of cooking fires. When adults tried to engage him in conversation about these markings, he would place his scarred palm over his heart, then over his forehead, in the same gesture Martha had made during her pregnancy. In December 1944, exactly 1 year after Martha's second marriage, the boy left a small slip of burned applewood on the common well's stone lip. Carved into its surface was the phrase, "When the quiet has answered, the bride returns." By morning, he was gone. Dark stains began appearing throughout the hollow that winter. Circular patterns on cabin floors, spiraling marks on barn walls, ring-shaped discolorations around the well where the wooden slip had been placed. The stains resisted all attempts at cleaning, growing darker and more defined with each scrubbing, until families learned to ignore them rather than fight their persistence. In 1967, County Surveyor Robert Ashworth arrived in Ridge Hollow to update property maps for a planned highway expansion that would ultimately be rerouted around the area. His field notes, discovered in his truck after his disappearance, document the discovery of structural anomalies that challenged his professional training. "Found spiral staircase behind false wall in Craddock House basement," he wrote. "Stone steps descend in perfect mathematical progression to circular chamber approximately 30 feet below ground level. Walls lined with mirrors that reflect the same room from impossible angles. Measured chamber dimensions 3 times with identical instruments. Results vary by significant margins. The chamber contained a single piece of furniture, a wooden table bearing a ring identical to those worn by Hollow women, though this one was carved with initials that seemed to rearrange themselves when viewed peripherally. Ashworth's sketches show the letters MC transforming into JC, and back again, as if the carved surface refused to maintain consistent markings. His final report ended mid-sentence. "The implications of what I have discovered require consultation with authorities better equipped to understand the significance of intentional architectural—" The rest of the page was blank. Ashworth's resignation letter arrived at the county office 3 days before he was scheduled to return from the field. The letter was written in handwriting that matched his signature, but showed subtle variations in letter formation that suggested someone else had carefully copied his script. He was never seen again. A dark stain in the shape of a perfect ring marked the floor where the wooden table had stood, but the chamber itself could never be located again, despite repeated attempts by subsequent surveyors to follow Ashworth's detailed directions. Graduate student Lees. Sir Marchetti arrived in Ridge Hollow in 1983 to research her dissertation on isolated community medical practices in Appalachian communities. What she discovered was a pattern of fires, property transfers, and disappearances that mapped onto a spiral configuration when plotted chronologically. Working with recently microfilmed census records, She documented bloodline connections that revealed the mathematical precision underlying hollow marriages across generations. Her research notes show family trees drawn in spiral configurations rather than traditional branching patterns, with connecting lines that curved back on themselves in ways that created closed loops spanning decades. The breakthrough came when she gained access to federal files declassified under the 50-year rule. Most pages were heavily redacted, but one paragraph remained legible. Evidence suggests intentional multi-generation experimentation by unknown parties utilizing isolated population for purposes that remain unclear. Recommend continued monitoring and maintenance of current classification levels. Marchetti's academic advisor received notice of her dismissal from the graduate program 2 weeks after she submitted her preliminary findings. The official reason cited failure to maintain appropriate academic standards, but colleagues noted that her research methodology had been exemplary until her work in Ridge Hollow began. She withdrew from academic life entirely, taking a position with a small-town newspaper in Oregon, where she covered local politics and avoided any research that might require federal record access. Letters to former colleagues described nightmares about overlapping voices and mirrors that showed the same face at different ages. Her Ridge Hollow research materials were never returned to the university, though her apartment showed no signs of break-in or struggle. The only item left behind was a spiral-shaped water stain on her desk, where she had apparently left a wet glass sitting in the same position for extended periods. Official explanations exist for every strange event documented in Ridge Hollow's history. The 1943 birth records were damaged by a water leak and had to be recreated from memory. The federal investigation was a routine public health assessment of rural medical facilities. The disappearances were voluntary relocations by individuals seeking opportunities in larger cities. Skeptics point to the isolated nature of mountain communities, where inbreeding and limited medical access can produce tragic outcomes that folklore transforms into supernatural narratives. The spiral patterns found throughout the hollow could be traditional Appalachian quilting designs or folk art motifs with no deeper significance. But the records themselves resist these rational explanations. Original documents continue to surface in unexpected locations, bearing details that contradict the sanitized versions filed with government agencies. Photographs develop spiral distortions when copied. Voice recordings capture overlapping conversations from single speakers. The applewood rings worn by hollow women show craftsmanship that appears to exceed the tools and techniques available to their supposed creators. Microscopic analysis reveals grain patterns that spiral inward towards centers that seem to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the carved wood. Most disturbing are the consistency of witness accounts across decades and the precision of details that appear in testimonies from people who never met and had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. The same phrases appear in documents separated by generations, written in handwriting that shows remarkable similarity despite different supposed authors. The applewood ring surfaced one last time in 2019, found in the estate sale belongings of a woman named Martha Craddock, who died in Portland, Oregon, 800 miles from Ridge Hollow. The ring's new owner, an antique collector, reported that it felt warm to the touch, despite being stored in a cold basement for months. Within a week of the ring's sale, local news reported the birth of twins to an unnamed mother at Portland General Hospital. The infants were described as medically unique before the story disappeared from news cycles. Hospital records show only routine births for that time period. 3 months later, spiral-shaped water stains began appearing in businesses throughout Portland's downtown district. They form overnight, resist all cleaning attempts, and seem to move to new locations when no one is watching. City maintenance crews have learned to paint over them rather than try to remove them. The quiet has found new ground to work in, new bloodlines to bend back on themselves, new mirrors to crack with impossible reflections. Ridge Hollow may have been just the beginning, a testing ground for something that learned patience across generations and now knows how to spread beyond isolated mountain valleys. But that's just folklore, isn't it? Just stories mountain people tell to explain the unexplainable. to give meaning to coincidences and tragedy. Tell me in the comments, have you ever seen spiral-shaped stains that appear overnight and resist cleaning? Have you heard overlapping voices from single speakers? Have you found family records that contradict themselves in impossible ways? And if you want to hear about other cases that were sealed and forgotten, other investigations that ended with missing researchers and classified files, subscribe and let me know which sealed file you want me to open next. Some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the government tries to bury them. The ring is still out there, passing from hand to hand, waiting for the next Martha to slip it onto her finger and feel the weight of obligation settle into her bones. When the quiet answers, the bride returns, and she's always returning.